recently retired wildlife biologist with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, where for 38 years he guided the state in land stewarding. Ricky is the author of Range Plants of North Central Texas, which assists landowners to better manage rangelands for sustainable use by livestock and wildlife. Ricky, take it away.
All right. Thank you all very much. Some people ask about this book, if it's still available. And I'm glad to say that Britt is now printing this book, and you can find it at shopbrittpress.org. And let me make my screen full size. There we go. All right, I've got a cat that's bothering me here. Didn't shut the door when I came in here. But it's been out since 2014, but Britt now has it. So if you're looking for it, there's where you can find it. Here's a sample of some of the pages. It covers 324 plants of North Central Texas and lots of good information. What we're here to talk about, though, is this presentation on In Search of a Perfect Red and how the combination of cochineal, prickly pear, and the early Spaniard explorers forged a dyeing industry that lasted for centuries. And most of the information I got from these two books, I pulled out, for this presentation, I pulled out of these two books. The one on the left, A Perfect Red, a lot of history about the plant. The one on the right is more about the fashions, the fancy dresses and clothing, but a lot of good information in both. And at the time, I didn't own either one of these two books. This lady on the left, Catherine Dixon, sent me one of the books and then later sent me another one. And that's where I've pulled this program together. Catherine and I had worked together for several years, helping kids on the land. You can read what it is, a STEM project. She and I worked together on the insect day. She liked to do the ladybugs part of the program, and she said, "Can you do cochineal?" And I'd already knew what cochineal was. I saw the white stuff on the prickly pear, and if you mashed it, it would make the red juice. And so I said, "You bet." And so that's how all of this came about. She and Peggy Maddox, the other lady in the photo, head up this Kids on the Land event, and it's a great event that goes on in the spring and the summer. They bring 3rd, 4th, 5th, sometimes 6th grades, depending on the school, out for a one-day out on the land, ride the school bus out on the ranch, and you learn about plants one day, insects one day, water one day, and then our history and stewardship of the land on another day. But if we look at the color red, it's been used in a lot of ways throughout time. Red flags meant danger. We roll out the red carpet for some events, celebrate red letter days. Strangely, I'd heard of getting tied up in red tape, and the red tapes dealt with, refers back to the red ribbons that bound 17th and 18th century British legal documents. Those were the red tapes. And back in the 60s and 70s, you know, communists, the Red Menace, we feared that. And then we stop at red signs, stoplights. So in fact, if you see red, it's a sign that you're enraged, and you see red. But the color red is a color that has been ingrained into our brains for thousands of years. Other than white and black, it is the most desired color throughout the ages, going back to the cavemen. If we look back that far, they dug up a mineral called red ochre. That's it in the middle on that upper left photo. They would grind it up into a powder, and 39,000 years BCE, I had to look that up, before Christian event is how they're describing that now. on a cave painting in Spain, they would put their hand up on the wall, put some of that red ochre in the other hand and just blow and make a tracing of their hand. But by about 20,000 years later, that lower left photo, now they are becoming pretty good artists. And red ochre was one of the main color pigments that they would use. They painted or dusted on the red coloring onto their dead and buried them. So it's been in use for thousands and thousands of years. Cinnabar is another mineral that was used early on. I'm gonna see if I can hide this. Right there. Okay. Cinnabar was used, especially in China, as far back as 5th century BC. Another mineral that would have to be dug up, ground up. It had some toxic properties, though, because it contained mercury. So people that worked with this, ground it up, even the people that used it often became sick with mercury poisoning. And in the first 1,000 years AD, red clothing was very hard to come by because there was very few good red dyes. Madder was used in ancient Egypt, worn by Greek and Roman warriors, and they got this color by grinding up the roots of plants in the Rubiaceae family. So think of beets, beet red. The only problem they had, and just like you can see in the photos on the right, those roots varied in color. This one right here is a very dark red, almost maroon color. This one is very light pinkish. So they did not get consistent colors with madder, but it was cheap, easy to get. You just grew the plants, dug them up, dried them, ground them up, and got what you got. Then they also used a wood called Brazil wood, and it was a tropical hardwood found in the Old East, talking China, Eurasia. The colors varied from scarlet to purple, but they faded over time. And then these early explorers, when they came to South America, they found a tree very similar, and they called that tree, because of the relation to Brazil wood, they called that area Brazil. Now you know how it was named. And then lac was another source of color. We know it now. We get lacquer and shellac from it. This insect, Laccifer lacca, secreted the sticky resin on the tree limbs and twigs. And sometimes the insects got covered up in the resin themselves. But it produced a fiery red on wood and leather. So good for artists, but less desirable for textiles. It did not produce that same flaming red color. And then they had an insect that would get on some of the oak trees, again, in the old Europe countries. This insect, though, they found that it worked better on animal fibers, wool and mohair, than it did on plant fibers, like linen, muslin. So it had its limitations as trying to find good color for clothing. And then St. John's blood, they called it the Polish cochineal, very similar to the cochineal we have in the New World. And it was found underground on roots of the sclereth plant. And it did produce a brilliant and useful dye. The only problem with it is, if we think about a similar plant in our world, think of skunk bush sumac. So you got to dig up the skunk bush sumac, scrape these cochineal insects off of the roots, then replant that plant, hopefully to keep it alive and growing where more cochineal will be attracted to it. Very labor intensive, very hard to get that. But it did produce a brilliant red color, and this was likely the red that most of the royalty and high elite wealthy people would be wearing. The poor people had to settle for the madder, the orangey red, brick red madder. So there was a class differentiation in the colors of the clothing. And then we started hearing stories of tales brought back from the explorers. They said, you know, when he come to the Americas, there's precious metals lying upon the ground everywhere. Ponce de Leon said he discovered the fountain of youth. They talked about the 7 golden cities, those early conquistador explorers. And all these tales were not true, but there was one tale that they talked about, and that was the early naval sailors that went down into Central South America. They came back with stories about this insect that grew on a cactus. Now, in the 1500s, they did not have photographs. They had drawings. So these are stylized drawings of the era. I mean, these are original drawings. The one on the right is sort of artistic interpretation, because the cochineal does not grow in a little rounded oblong circle on the middle of the pads. They grow all over the pads, but it does show the people harvesting the cochineal, and they using a stick to scrape it into a bowl. The drawing on the left shows the cochineal, and the ones in South America do not have as much of the white covering as they do here in Texas and Mexico. If you compare that, you can actually see the insect in these drawings, but here in Texas, the insects are covered with this white cottony webbing, which we think has got maybe 2 purposes. One is camouflage, to hide the insects from lizards, birds, bigger insects that will eat the scale insect cochineal, and it serves as sunscreen to keep the sun from scalding these bugs. When they hatch out and they start feeding on a prickly pear, they stay there for life. So if you get on the sunny side of a pad, you know, you need some sunscreen. These early sailors, the conquistadors, they started noticing that, hey, you know, everybody is wearing this bright red clothing. And back in Spain, it's only the royalty that can wear clothes like this. So what is going on? We need to find out more about this. And you can see in the bazaars, they found all types of clothing, tapestries, rugs, all brightly colored. And then they saw a few clothing items like this dress, and they got to thinking, you know, we came here for gold and silver and jewels, but if we could find the source of what makes this red clothing, we could have something really important to send back to Spain. So they knew that there was this new dye from the Americas. That was known. What was not known was, what did this insect come from? What was it? Because it's actually a dried insect when it's found ground up to be made into the dye. But what it actually is, it's a scale insect, Dactylopius coccus, and we call it cochineal. Here it is on the enlargement on the right-hand side of the screen. And the red coloring does not come from the prickly pear. If you cut open a prickly pear, it's a greenish, light green, whitish color on the inside of the pad. Where does the red come from? That's coming from the insect itself. So they feed upon the opuntia. Females lay their eggs, they hatch. Females insert proboscis into the pad, and they remain on that pad, like I said, for their entire life. The winged males fly around mating with the females. Here are some of the predators that prey upon cochineal, and that's why they can use that cottony covering. But the females have protection other than that cottony covering, and that is the carminic acid. So here is, for the scientific folks in the crowd, here's the chemistry formula for carminic acid, and it is produced within the body, distasteful to predators, and they think it also has some healing effects to keep internal parasites down on the cochineal. So there's what it looks like dried on the left. You can actually buy dried cochineal. You can buy it on Amazon, have it delivered tomorrow. 1 ounce bottle is about $15. And that's 1 ounce on that bowl on the left. So when the conquistadors saw it, it was like this right here on the right. It was just dried up. You couldn't really tell what it was, or they would buy it or steal it, however they obtained it, as this already ground formula. And they began to find out that the Aztecs and ancient Mexicans had been using cochineal for hundreds, over 1,000 years. In fact, they had a name for it, Nochetzli, or blood of the nopal. And they were actually farming them. Look at those drawings on the right. It looks like they're out in their garden. They're tending the prickly pear, but actually they're tending the cochineal. And again, the photo on the left, actually a recent photo from down in Mexico. And you see they are trying to protect themselves. They don't have as many thorns on the prickly pear down there as we have, but they're still trying to protect themselves from the prickly pear, and they're not touching the cochineal. They considered it bad form to touch the cochineal. They might pass on some sort of fungus or something that would be harmful. And this is a drawing that we use at Kids on the Land, a big poster to show the kids that come. And look at the bright red pantaloons of this peasant. And he's using, we couldn't read what this said down here on the bottom. And one of the family members of the ranch that we host this on could read Latin. And they told us that this meant the Indian collecting cochineal with a deer tail, using it like a brush to scrape the cochineal off of the prickly pear. And in figure 2, it translates to bliss. Not sure how that fits. It looks like it's describing a deer tail. And then figure 3 shows the bowl in which they collect or protect, it says, the bug. And here's another page out of one of the books that shows a folded up drawing of different ways that cochineal was protected. Here they've got some just lattice-like boards across the top of their garden. Here they've got, looks like sails protecting, keeping some of the sun off of the cochineal. This looks like would be the hardest to put up, are these rounded ones. What kind of a wooden hoop is inside of that to make that round? And then here we have just like a shed roof made out of some type of probably grass or some type of organic material. And then they have these pots on the fire right here, because one of the ways that they would kill the insects was to boil them in hot water. And then they would spread the cochineal out on these mats and let them dry, totally dry in the sun, and then bag them up and then take them to the markets and sell them or trade them, however they were marketing them. Here's another photo. Again, look at the garden. They've even got a little garden up here on this hillside. And this lady has got a rolling pin on a board, and she is actually crushing. She's using the fresh cochineal, I believe here, to crush up and make into a dye. Now, where Spain became involved in the cochineal industry, it all began with a early sailor, Cortez. He arrived in the Caribbean islands 1506, and then in 1511 he joined an expedition to Cuba under Diego Velázquez. And then in 1518 he was put in charge of an expedition to the mainland, to Mexico, and Diego had a ulterior motive. They had already tried, Spain had already sent several ships to Mexico, Central America here, trying to establish a colony, and they had all been defeated, killed. And Diego said, well, let's let this young upstart Cortez go to Mexico and see what he can do. So he did. He sent Cortez in 1519, and they landed, started walking into the towns and the Aztec communities there, and they found the Aztecs selling that red dye in 1519, 500 years ago. That's when it first started. And all of this area in green was no longer, but was the Aztec Empire. And then Cortez, along with his soldiers and the aid of the Tlaxcala people who fought with the Aztecs, defeated the Aztecs in 1521. So this changed the way the country had been operating. But they have documented many uses for cochineal. Doctors mixed it with vinegar. This would be like a decoction to treat wounds, prescribed to cure the ills of the head, heart, and stomach. Cooks added it to tamales and other foods to give it flavor or to give it coloring. Women colored their necks, cheeks, and hands, like putting on lipstick and mascara. And then this is where it was really came into its own, was the dyers mixed it with alum as a mordant, and a mordant means to bite. So this color bites into the fabric and stays, hangs into the fabric. And all of these different shades of red, maroon are made with cochineal. They get the variation in the color by the length of time they leave the fibers, the linen or whatever that is that they're using, the strings, they leave those in the water that's boiling longer, they get a deeper red color. Sometimes the water quality itself affects the color. And they said sometimes the iron pots themselves would impart a color onto the fabric. And the Aztecs, again, they were, kind of lords over some of these other communities, and they demanded tribute, like from the Tlaxcala people. And estimates over 100 bags of dried cochineal per year, meaning that's over 9 tons, and that's more than 1 billion insects. So a lot of cochineal was harvested every year. It was a renewable resource. But they also mentioned that sometimes if the people were higher up in the mountains and it got colder, they would actually bring some of the cochineal madres, the pregnant females, into their cabins during the winter to keep them alive. And then they would take them out in the spring and put them on the prickly pear to hatch and spread out. And I guess they were thinking that if we lose some, we won't lose all. We'll still have a little seed stock here that we can keep alive in the house if it gets too cold. And again, those early conquistadors, they were after gold and silver, precious jewels, but what they found gave them more money than the gold and silver. They found this precious color of red. And again, this is how it would have been shipped to Spain. They loaded it up on the ships. It bounced around, sliding back and forth in those ships with the roll of the waves. And a lot of these became, the insects were kind of ground against each other. And when it got to Spain 3 months later, it was really hard to see what that was. But they told the dyers, well, grind it up and boil it with water, and you'll see what we're talking about. So it made the first shipment to Spain, arrived in late October of 1519. The dyers, again, they had been using madder, oak kermes, Polish cochineal. They knew how to work with that, but this was something new. And for about, 30 years, cochineal had to be proven. They were slow to adopt it, but they found out over that 30-year period, when they began to say, okay, this is good, that it had more carminic acid with fewer lipids than other dyes. So those insects, the oak kermes and the Polish cochineal that they had been using, had lipids or fat in their bodies. And when you boiled that, those lipids would attach to the fabric or to the thread, and the dye would not could not be absorbed by the fabric because of that fat. So that was a bad thing. But cochineal had less of these lipids, so it did not make the splotchiness in the dyes. And it was easier to produce, could be harvested 2 to 3 times a year back in Mexico. And it yielded a far more powerful dye than any of the old world dyes. And caving to the demands of customers who wanted cochineal, the Venetian textile guilds legalized the use of cochineal in 1554, calling it grana cochineal. And they said it made the brightest red color the old world had ever seen. And remember, Spain is the only one that knows about this. And several of the master dyers over there said it's the finest and best dye drug in the world. And Spain, because they had the market cornered, they knew where it was and what it was, made a fortune selling the dye to Europe, Italy, all around the world, China. And again, here it is on the right, the different shades of coloring that can be made from this one source of dye. Here's a drawing on the left showing them boiling it, taking a stick, dipping down, looking at it. Nope, it needs to go back in. Let's get it a little darker. And here, 460 or so years later, in Mexico, it's done the same way, and often still over a wooden fire. So the way they do it to get this color has not changed. One of the few things we can say in our world that has not changed in nearly 500 years. Now, this drawing of the Jewish bride by Rembrandt, what is that, about 350 years ago? The dress of the bride, and that's her father in the photo, or the drawing, the bride's dress is made from cochineal. And it is said that it is as bright now, 350 years later, as the day it was painted, showing the lasting effects of the color produced by cochineal. And there's people looking at it. We talk about the textile industry in the 15th century. This was a huge, took a lot of labor, created a lot of markets. You had shepherds on the farm growing the sheep, the wool, the mohair, the goats, all the way to the market itself. Took a lot of labor, but it provided jobs and money that these people that didn't have any other way to make a living needed the money. The dyers had to undergo an apprenticeship. If you were a dyer of reds, yellows, and greens, your apprenticeship might be 3 to 5 years. But if you wanted to be a dyer of the red coloring, your apprenticeship was 5 to 7 years. And then it might take another 7 years before you could be considered a master dyer. So it was very intensive work. Look at the steps that it would take to get wool produced, which was the most common fiber they had in Europe. Shepherds raised the sheep, shearers fleeced the sheep, washers cleaned the raw wool, carders using wooden and iron cards pulled the fibers apart, spinners spun the fiber into yarn, weavers wove it into cloth, fullers washed and treated the cloth, and the dry fabric was handed off to the dyers. So this is the process that it went through. And it was so expensive that throughout most of Europe, only the aristocrats and wealthy elites were allowed to wear scarlet. And by law, pheasants were forbidden to wear the color, one of the authors of the book I was quoting. And here's King Charles in 1548. Now remember, the guild in Spain did not approve it till the 1550s. He's already using it. Notice the bright red plume on his helmet. He's got a red headband around the helmet, a red sash. The horse has got a fancy headdress. He's got red reins and a red saddle blanket to offset the color of that gold armor that he's wearing. So he was using it. He adopted it early for the style that it gave him. well, I was going to say Queen Elizabeth, but it's actually Elizabeth I while she was still a princess in 1546, wearing quite the exquisite gown. And King Charles Louis, 1637, 100 years later, the red breeches he's wearing and this split sleeve shirt that he's got on, quite dashing. And there's an interesting story in the book about Mary, Queen of Scots, cousin to Queen Elizabeth. Now, if we go back 1546, Elizabeth was a princess, but in 1587, she is queen now. And Mary tried to stage a revolt against the leaders of England, and she was put down. The revolt was crushed. Queen Elizabeth said, "You must be punished. You will be executed." And in the book, it said that 300 people received a ticket, basically, a admission to her beheading, which was held in 1587, Fotheringhay Castle in England. Now, look at the way she's dressed. It said she came in almost like a nun, black velvet overcoat, white headscarf. But look at this pink or this red hint color right here. When she got to the executioner stage, she threw back the black robe, pulled off the white head net, and she was dressed in red. Red was a color of royalty. It was the color of courage, and it was the color that represented martyrdom. She was a martyr for her cause. And here is a picture from a movie. I was actually scoping through the TV guide on the TV one night, and I saw this movie. It said Mary of Scots, and I turned it on, and sure enough, I happened to hit it right at about the part where she was executed. Look at the hairstyle. They copied that really close. And here's that red dress that she had on under the black robe. Here's where Cochineal was found. It went to Cuba, and then from Cuba to Spain, and then from Spain everywhere else. So look at all of the locations that took advantage of the cochineal. It was indeed a worldwide industry. And again, Spain controlled it, which was going to be a problem, because now England had been buying cochineal from Spain, but Spain put halted that sale to England. So the England said, well, we'll just start raiding those Spanish ships. And they did this for about a century. This gentleman, the Earl of Essex, Robert Devereux, captained, and it didn't say how many, but I'm estimating, probably 30 to 50 ships and 1,000 men in search of cochineal early in 1597. He's dressed also in quite a bit of red, if you notice. And they came upon, they split up, and they came upon a huge convoy of the Spanish ships heading back to Spain. And they fell in behind them. And they said after a couple of days, 3 of these Spanish ships lagged behind. They fell behind. The other ships didn't come back for them. They went on. So Devereux and his sailors captured those 3 ships. They did not just move some of the cochineal over to their ship. There was so much of it, the ship was basically loaded with cochineal. So they just put about half of the Spanish sailors into lifeboats and cast them to sea. They kept about half to actually work the ship. They put a few of their soldiers on those 3 ships, and they sailed the 3 Spanish ships with their ships back to England. And when they got there and started unloading the ships, they had 27 tons of cochineal. So look at the shipments of cochineal that were going to Spain. And this is what the English were trying to siphon off. But 1557, less than 57,000 pounds. Less than 20 years later, it had tripled to 150,000 pounds. And in 1586, that's when the embargo, Spain embargoed England and Holland. And wasn't long after that, the English were starting to capture the cochineal from the ships. Here's 30,000 pounds captured in 1 year, 600 heavy cases captured. Robert Flick described his capture of 42 crates from one ship. And when they captured, the English would fire a cannon shot across the bow of the ship. If the Spaniard captain did not want to fight, he would just stop, let the sails down, they would be boarded, and they would take what they wanted. But if he fought, there would be a battle, and one of the other ships would not survive. So most of the time, the Spaniard captain would stop, and they would steal the cochineal. In this case, Robert Flick described that there were 42 cases of cochineal and over 4,000 hides, animal hides. And as they were unloading offloading the crates to their ship, they noticed water started coming into the Spanish ship. Somebody had sabotaged it and it was sinking. And he said they left that ship in 4,000 hides to go to the bottom of the ocean, but they did take all of the cochineal. There in 1597, there's the high water mark, the 27 tons, 55,000 pounds, captured by Robert Essex. And these bankers were funding some of these Spanish ships, putting the money up for them to go and get the cochineal. And they were crying, English raiders have taken several Spanish prizes with over 20,000 pounds of cochineal and gold and silver as well. The royalty in Spain also put up some of the money, and they were losing money as well. Now, it said that England's Queen Elizabeth was at first displeased with Robert Essex for not capturing those other 27 ships. And she was kind of a hothead, apparently. And it said in the book, he was also as volatile as the Queen. He stormed off, went to his villa, and didn't come back, to the Queen for a long time. But 3 months later, she gave him a prize, 7,000 pounds of cochineal, and allowed him to buy additional cochineal at 40 cents on the dollar, which was about $1 a pound is what they said it was going for. So he got it at quite the discount. She was trying to make up, I guess, to Essex. But 3 years to the day later, he led a rebellion, much like Mary of Scots did, against her court. And just like what happened with Mary of Scots, the uprising was quelled. Essex was condemned to death for treason, to be beheaded. And, I got to wondering, well, there was a movie on Mary of Scots. I wonder if there would be a movie about Essex. And I found one, but in the book it said he used the red color. He had on red shirt, red pants to show nobility, the fighting spirit, and to prove he was a man of courage to the last. And here's a drawing of his execution here. And this is where I was talking about wondering if there was a movie, and yes, there was. Back in 2011, the film Anonymous, here it is. Again, he's red-headed, but wearing the red clothing. So a man of courage to the end. But then, from its arrival in Spain in 1519 until 1725, everyone they knew they had what made the dye, but they did not know what it was. They asked, does it originate as plant, animal, or mineral? And for 200 years, 15 to the 1700s, this question went unanswered. They consulted the Bible, which did not mention the New World. They consulted the classical philosophers, Pliny the Elder, who was a Roman, and a Greek physician, Dioscorides, both for 1st century AD. They did not have anything to add to describe this. But what the Spaniards came to believe was that direct observations would be better than going back and looking at these classical thoughts that did not really help them. But even direct observation from people seeing it on the ground had its faults. Fernandez de Oviedo, soldier, naturalist, he wrote a couple of books. Historia Natural, 1526, 7 years after they first got to the Aztec country, and he described the nopal cactus. Then in 1535, he described eating the nopal's tuna and described a red dye attributed to the tunas. Now, see, he's missed the boat, in fact, because the tunas are not where the red coloring was coming from. Then in the 1540s, a Franciscan friar called the dye nochetzli and said it was produced by trees. Again, incorrect. In the book Historia Victrix, Gomera said it came from nochetzli fruit, the tunas. Again, incorrect. Then 1554, here's where it was beginning to come to truthfulness. Francisco Salazar noted that on the nopal, on the cactus, some little worm-like creatures, which when killed in ashes are a very fine grain, the best that is known. But he said that was true. But then he said cactus somehow bred the worms within its flowers, which was not true. And here's the saddest story I'll share with you. In the 1570s, Bernardino de Sahagún, Franciscan friar, spent decades. He arrived in the Aztec country in about 1525, and he wrote this book in the 1570s, actually a manuscript. But he said this cochineal is an insect. It is a worm. The cochineal nopal is the breeding place of the cochineal. It lives, it hatches on the nopal like a little fly, a little insect. Totally true. But in 1577, the original copy of the manuscript was confiscated by Philip II because he did not want word to get out where the cochineal was and what it was. But then he eventually said, no, they'll just think this is artistic interpretation. It's not a threat. But he didn't give it back to Sahagún. He gave it as a wedding gift, and it was lost for 300 years. But once it came to light and was published in 1879, it was described as the single most important source on Aztec life and culture. Of course, by then, 300 years later, they knew a lot more about all of this information, but he was the original one to get it correct, and he never lived to see the book published. Sad fact. 1590, Acosta said are born some worms that are fixed to the cactus and covered with a certain thin coating. Now that's that white cottony coating we talked about. Herrera said the cochineal is a living thing, a kind of round worm that is large as a lentil. Again, when it gets to England or to Spain, it does not look like a living thing. So they were still confused. By the 1600s, they began to accept the facts, but not all in Europe accepted this. In the summer of 1865, a chemist named Robert Boyle asked another chemist, friend, scientist named Leeuwenhoek to look under a microscope at the dried cochineal, and Leeuwenhoek had earlier pronounced them just dried seeds. But there was a Dutch botanist named Swammerdam, who his specialty was studying insects under microscopes. Now in the 1860s, their microscopes were pretty crude. In September 1685, Leeuwenhoek, using an early microscope, I've got an error in the date right there, that should be 1665, declared that each tiny grain is a part of a little animal, females whose body is full of eggs. He could see that under the microscope. And then another scientist named Hartsucker in 1694 reported, and I have found that the greatest part is full of a very great quantity of little eggs, which gave me an extremely red juice when I broke them. And he was the first one to make drawings of the cochineal. Now, this is the cochineal underside right here. Here it is. I'm not sure. These look like veins and arteries, but he's got a drawing. Look at this little microscope. Very basic, very crude. In 1704, he concluded that cochineal did not come from worms. Cochineal insects carried their young within and bring forth their own likeness. So they hatch out as little cochineal insects. And here is modern day photography. This is a female. Here are the legs and mouth parts. Here's the male with what looks like twin tails, a beaded antenna. Now look at those beaded antennas, because I want to show you a picture I took on a prickly pear. After one of the kids on the land, we had some left over and I brought it home. And I took this photo just because it was a good clump of cochineal. Here's some young ones, some even smaller ones, all trying to get attached and start sucking the juice out of the pear. And when I enlarged this part right here, well, look what I found. There was one of the males. And I didn't see him when I took the photo. But there's that beaded antenna. May have those twin tails pulled together right here, but that is the male. Very small. And in its heyday, the 1770s, 1.5 million pounds were being produced in Mexico each year. And that's 100 billion bugs harvested each year. Harvesting the cactus, farming the cactus, growing the cochineal. And they also had some of this growing in the Canary Islands, Guatemala, and Java. In those countries, little islands, they would produce 2 million pounds per year over a 20-year period, 2 million pounds per year. But in 1856, all of this was about to change. The reign of cochineal as the dominant red color was about to suffer damage. But it had reigned supreme for 337 years. This young man in the photo, William Henry Perkin, 18-year-old graduate of the, and now research assistant at London's Royal College of Chemistry, was an artist, but he was also, he loved chemistry. And as a research assistant, he was going to try to find a cure for malaria. And the only thing they had at the time was quinine, which came from the cinchona tree. Again, hard to find, hard to obtain in the South American Andes. So he was going to synthesize quinine, or he thought, from coal tar. And in the 1850s, this was the beginnings of gas lights. They would take crude oil and produce basically a gasoline, and to light the lights on the streets and in houses. And what they had left over was a byproduct called coal tar. And it's just full of all kinds of petroleum compounds. Some of the compounds that he worked with, he distilled down naphthalene, toluidine, and aniline, which, think about where we've heard aniline before. But he came up, none of these produced a cure for malaria. But in one of his tests, he noticed that the precipitate that was formed was sort of a dark reddish black color. And he went ahead and dried it, thinking back maybe to his days as an artist to see if it would make a color. And though it turned black, when he ground it up and mixed it with water and painted, it was a brilliant red. And he started thinking, well, we could make this into a dye. And so in his father's greenhouse in the backyard, it described, he made a little workspace in part of the greenhouse, and he called it Tyrian purple. Here's an original bottle right here, found on the internet. Later, they called it Perkins mauve, although his name was Perkin, not Perkins. And he sent a sample of this to the Scottish dyer, Robert Puller, and you can read what he said. One of the most valuable that has come out for a long time. Color is one which has been most wanted in all classes of goods. and could not be obtained fast on silks and only at great expense on cotton yarns. And these are letters and actual samples of the Perkins mauve from that time period. And you can see the clothing and the color that quite exquisite that it produced. And just a year or so later, Perkins dye was widely available from the London lab. He then expanded and made it commercial, got it out of the greenhouse, made it commercialized, widely successful in 1859. And his old boss, he'd quit the college and was making the dye. His old boss, August Hoffman, sort of erroneously stated in 1862 that England would soon be shipping tar distilled crimson to Cochineal producing Mexico, but it was not to be. Cochineal areas had ruled the top red dye stocks for over 300 years, but change was on the horizon. Now, you know, if you look around on the internet long enough, you can find anything. Look at this pricing of Cochineal that I was able to find from 1758 to 1854, 100 years of production in the solid bar and prices in the dash. So look at prices go up. What happens to production? It ramps up a year or so later, and it stays up. They produce so much of it, price goes down. Then when the price goes down, they quit harvesting, then production goes down, price goes up. But something happened right in here. For about 30 years, production could not catch up. It never did return until about the 1830s. And we see the production is up now and price is down. But that's amazing that sort of information can be found. So if we look at this world again, Dutch Java had been producing cochineal. They transplanted cochineal insects and cactus into these areas. Now over here at Oaxaca, they had it. They already had the cactus. Guatemala, down in this area right here, if I'm remembering, they had the insects. But the Canary Islands, they had to bring them in, but they could produce cochineal because they had a low cost. It didn't take much. Over here, it was awful wet, hard to protect the insects from getting too wet. So there were production costs that they had to assume. And then in Oaxaca and Guatemala, farmers produced more cochineal to offset the lower price. Much is what happened during the Dust Bowl here in the United States. The war effort in World War I, they wanted more wheat. They advertised wheat for the war, wheat for the country, wheat to feed the soldiers. And so they plowed up the Great Plains and planted wheat, which was a wet period in the 1917 through about 1928. The Great Plains produced a lot of wheat, a lot of rainfall. Then in the early 1930s, it began to dry up, and this problem became the Dust Bowl because that country should have stayed in grass. And they plowed up more land to offset the lower price of wheat, and they just kept doing it, and it blew up in their faces. So here's how cochineal grew. By 1870, Oaxaca produced over 500,000 pounds annually. Guatemala, 1.5 million pounds. The Canary Islands producing 5 to 6 million pounds annually, which was 3 times the production of the rest of the world. But again, change was on the horizon. By the mid-1870s, alizarin was produced. It was an exact chemical replica of madder, produced again by William Henry Perkin and chemists from the German firm BASF, which they are still in a company. BASF is still around. It was purer, brighter, less costly than madder, easier to produce, and it was the first artificial dye that was light and water fast. It did not fade. So in cochineal, after alizarin was produced, Guatemala, which had been producing 1.5 million pounds, was now producing less than 500,000 pounds. And then less than a year, 10 years later, less than 1,000 pounds, and they ceased production in 1890. And again, the Canary Islands, they were able to hold on because of lower cost. But then there was a problem with these artificial dyes. They contain some pretty nasty stuff. Arsenic acid and acetate triarsenite was used in these artificial dyes. And look, poison. Cochineal had no known health risk as a dye at the time. So Cochineal had a rebirth. It became a Renaissance dye, while these artificial dyes, again, were manipulated and converted into tear gas. Later, chlorine turned into poison gas in World War I. And that's a pretty good sized building and quite a number of bombs in that building that would have had poison gas and exploding tips. By 1909, in Oaxaca, Mexico, there were very few cochineal farmers left. They still had a few exports as late as 1932, here boiling it on a wood fire, trying to get the color. In 1947, the Mexican government sent a scientific expedition to Oaxaca to search for farmers still growing cochineal. They did not want to lose this industry. They didn't want to forget how to do cochineal. And this is a photograph showing some cochineal bugs that have been harvested and put into little bags that'll be picked up and taken somewhere else. And I'm not sure because this photo wasn't explained, this could have been bugs that had been brought from somewhere else and they were fixing to put them out on these prickly pear plants. And here's a modern day photo in Mexico. Look at the garden of prickly pear. They're still farming it, starting single pads, getting them growing and putting the cochineal madres on the pads to hatch out. And this lady on the right, she has crushed some of the living cochineal, and you see the red dye, and she's adding lemon juice as a mordant to set the color, to help it last. And you notice the prickly pear does not have the thorns like our prickly pear does. So it's a little easier to handle. And here's one of the woven grass and sometimes reed little cages that they would put the pregnant females in and transplant them around on the different cactus. And we're still doing it to this day the same way it was done in the 1500s. Boil it. If it's not dark enough, drop it back in there, boil it a little longer. Here's some different panels made using the same cochineal at different intensities, different water quality, showing you the variation of color. Now, I was a teenager in the 1960s, and I don't remember quite the fashion statements that these young ladies on the right have, but cochineal was reborn again because people thought, we want to have cleaner dyes. We want to have natural foods. So these dyes and food qualities of cochineal gave it a rebirth. But then a decade later, public fears due to problems with these dyes, the artificial dye known as red number 2 in the US and as E123 in Europe were a carcinogen. And the US Food and Drug Administration banned the use of these artificial dyes in 1976. And if you've ever eaten the Red Hots back in the 70s and 60s, you were eating those artificial dyes. They gave reasoning that it had a possible link to asthma, ADD, hyperactivity, and other issues. Once again, cochineal returned to favor, this time as a food dye. It had already returned as a colorant for clothing. And by 1990, they were producing over 1 million pounds worldwide. And here's some cochineal liquid coloring. If you look at some of these foods, cochineal extract in this little packet of pears, little cup of pears. And apparently even Coca-Cola used cochineal at one time. They show the female and the male. And if you've had any of these foods, you have had foods made with crushed bugs. Starbucks if you had their strawberry frappuccino from about a decade ago, it had cochineal in it. But someone must have got online and read the ingredients and saw they were eating crushed up bugs and bug guts, and they raised such a stink about it. Starbucks had to change to an artificial color for the strawberry frappuccino. But all of these items had cochineal coloring. And it comes from carmine. So it was found in Skittles, yogurts, grapefruit juice, ice cream, and still included in eye dust. Now look right here, ladies, iron oxides. To me, I think that's rust. So are we putting rust? Are you putting rust on your eyes? I'm wondering about that. And if you're using the tinted form, not the clear, but the tinted Burt's Bees lip balm, you are using cochineal colored lip balm. So for 250 years, from the end of the 17th century, the British Army adopted red as their uniform. In the early period, most of the common soldiers wore madder red. And then later on, as the cochineal became available, it started at the upper level that generals, the officers wore the cochineal red. And then eventually all of the soldiers were wearing cochineal colored uniforms. Cochineal even shows up in the American flag. Mary Pickersgill sewed the flag that flew over Fort McHenry during the Battle of Baltimore in 1814. This is when Francis Scott Key penned the Star-Spangled Banner. She had been commissioned to make two flags, a 17 by 25 foot storm flag and the stately banner that George Armstead, who wanted a 30 by 42 foot garrison flag, he said, to sew a flag so large that the British will have no difficulty seeing it from the distance. Now, this is that flag, the 30 by 42 foot flag. Notice it's not, if this is 30 foot top to bottom, it's only about 32, 34 foot long now. It's lost 10 feet. Part of that was damage in the battle. When the battle was over, the British did not win. The flag was taken and Mary Pickersgill repaired the flag. I think it flew a few more years. It was eventually retired and it was given to Mary Pickersgill. And it was kept in her family. They said soldiers would come by and say, "Can we see the flag? We fought in that battle," and it gave us such confidence when we looked up and saw that flag. And she said, "Yes, come in." And she would cut off a little square of the flag and give to each soldier that came to her and wanted to see it. So that's one reason that it's not as big as it used to be. So once we say, and I forgot to mention that the red coloring is cochineal colored. The blue was probably indigo, but the red was definitely cochineal. So now when we talk about the Star-Spangled Banner, you will know the red coloring in our flag originally came from cochineal. Even our Texas flag, look on the left, before the Texas Revolution, this Mexican Colonel Juan Almonte said that the cochineal crop gathered twice yearly in Texas, hauled to Laredo, shipped to agents of the British Crown. And they were using it to color their redcoats. So the British redcoats originally came from Texas cochineal. And when the Lone Star flag was adopted in 1839, the red field was dyed with cochineal. Now, it's hard to read. I'm going to spin this around right here. There it is, February, maybe January of 1839. The red, the color and the shape of the flag was approved, which we still have. So there's cochineal on the land in Texas, still growing. It comes and goes. Some years it's really prevalent. Some years it's hard to find it. About 5 years ago, I was at a field day at Baird, and there was a piece of equipment there, a bobcat that had scissors on the front. And he could grab a mesquite and pull it out of the ground, those that were about this diameter. Here's the marks where he grabbed onto it. He would drop them on the ground, move over, get another one. He kept demonstrating that. And we noticed this white stuff on the mesquite. We walked over there and I scraped one of them off and mashed it. And it made this orange little weak dye on my fingers. And I took it and got my camera out, took good close-up photos, and this is a scale insect. If you notice this one right here, this was down in the grass. This one got slid down about a 1/4 inch from where it originally had been, but these are all cochineal insects. And they were eating the bark of the mesquite, and that's where that orange coloring was coming from. I sent this photo around several people that I thought, they were experts in their field, and no one really came up with a good identification on this. But it's a form of cochineal. It's one of the cochineals. So again, there's our cochineal, the tunas, not the color that produces the red, but definitely the cochineal itself. It also can be found on Pear Cactus. But with that, that's our program today. If you have any questions, if we have time, sorry I was late getting on, be glad to take them. And I'll stop sharing and turn it back. I don't know if I can stop sharing right here because I've lost the bar. I hit the bar and now I can't get it back up.
So, Ricky, there is a question in the chat. Are only female insects used to create cochineal?
Yes, they're, unless just a male happened to get caught up like I showed in that photo, they're only harvesting the females. One additional thing they said about the males is they don't live as long as the females. They fly around mating with the females, but it said that their mouth parts would atrophy and they could no longer feed and they would die. So their lifespan was a lot shorter, but only the females produce, I'd say 99.999% of the cochineal used as coloring.
Cool. Any other questions for Ricky? It's a very thorough presentation today. A lot of great history in there.
Well, I was thoroughly, I thought I knew a little about cochineal, but it wasn't until I really started reading and studying and trying to research it that I really became a fan of the cochineal, and I appreciate it even more now.
I think that's all the questions we got today. Thank you so much, Ricky, for enlightening us and making us see red today. So,
well, I hope it wasn't because of rage.
No. Just the color. So
that's good. Yes, I understand.
All right. Thank you guys so much, and join us next month for another episode of Naturalists Present. Have a great weekend, everyone.